Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be exploring pornography, addiction, and recovery. Through Jack Pigot's personal story on YouTube. He's an Australian guy, and he's put together quite a few videos on this.
It's really powerful to hear these firsthand accounts like Jack's.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
Yeah,
we read the statistics and research papers, but it really hits home when you hear someone's personal struggles.
absolutely. And what's interesting is how this all starts. Jack talks about when he was 12 years old. His stepsister actually showed him something explicit, and he describes feeling disgusted at the time.
It's so jarring at that age, right? You're just not expecting it.
Mm.
And so, it can create that sense of aversion like Jack felt, but it kind of plants a seed that can be revisited later on.
And revisited it was.
Right.
About a year later, Jack was on his family's iPod, and a pornographic pop-up appeared. This time he said he felt aroused.
And that's where you start to see the addictive nature of porn. The dopamine rush that comes with viewing it. It's really powerful. So your brain has a reward system. And when you do something pleasurable, it releases dopamine, makes you feel good. But the problem is, with a repeated exposure to this highly stimulating content, your brain starts to crave more and more just to get that same hit.
So it's not even just willpower, there's brain chemistry involved.
Exactly. And as Jack's viewing frequency increased, he started to experience these changes in his life. He talks about losing interest in things he used to enjoy, like playing basketball with his friends, even going for walks or having conversations. They started feeling really dull compared to what he was getting from porn.
Wow, that's a pretty big shift. The virtual world starting to eclipse the real world.
Yeah, and there's a part in Jack's story that I think a lot of people can relate to, especially, young men. He talks about having a girlfriend for a while and how during that time he had absolutely no urge to watch porn. But after they broke up, he kind of fell back into those old patterns and things escalated quickly.
It's like that genuine connection he had. It was fulfilling a need that porn was only temporarily masking.
Yeah, exactly. It speaks to understanding what's underneath, the emotional needs that porn might be trying to address. It's not just about sexual gratification. It's often about seeking connection or validation or a way to just escape from emotions.
And Jack even admits that after being so heavily involved with porn, his confidence around women actually decreased. He was putting them on a pedestal, creating these unrealistic expectations based on what he was seeing.
That's right. And it distorts perceptions of relationships and intimacy, makes it hard to connect with real people in an authentic way.
I think there's a good anecdote that he shares that kind of brings this to life. He describes being out to lunch with his family, and he sees a woman that reminds him of someone from a pornographic video. And he just gets completely preoccupied with her, can't focus on anything else.
Yeah, it's like his brain was trying to make sense of the real world through that lens of porn that he felt. It can be so unsettling. And it can also have a negative impact on your self-esteem and your ability to form healthy relationships.
Almost like a feedback loop of his own making. And speaking of feedback loops, Jack goes on to describe some pretty concerning physical symptoms, like fatigue and paleness. Tried addressing it through diet and exercise and skincare, but nothing seemed to help.
It's important to remember that correlation doesn't equal causation. But there have been studies that suggest a link between, excessive porn consumption and certain physical and mental health issues.
So it's not just psychological, there can be physical impacts as well.
Exactly. And this is where Jack's story takes a bit of a turn. He talked about discovering something called semen retention, which he believes has had a positive effect on his energy levels and his overall well-being.
I've heard of this before, but I have to admit I'm pretty skeptical. What's the science behind it?
Well, that's the tricky part. While some individuals report perceived benefits, the scientific community hasn't really reached a consensus on its effectiveness.
So approach with caution. Just because Jack experienced something positive doesn't mean it's universally applicable.
Right, and it's crucial to remember that if anyone is struggling with their relationship to porn or experiencing negative effects, seeking professional guidance from a therapist or counselor is always the most responsible approach.
Solid advice. So things take a bit of a downward spiral for Jack when he tries out for a competitive basketball team, and he doesn't make the cut. He describes this as a major turning point. That led him to fall even deeper into pornography use.
This is a good example of how difficult life events can be triggers, like feelings of inadequacy or rejection, and it can lead to these addictive behaviors as a way of coping, albeit an unhealthy one. And for Jack, the rejection amplified his need for validation and escape, pushing him further into that cycle.
He talks about watching porn multiple times a day, even going so far as to say it was his purpose at that point. It's heartbreaking to hear him describe how lost he felt.
It's a classic example of how addiction distorts your sense of self and your sense of purpose. The behavior provides temporary relief or escape, but it ultimately reinforces those underlying issues that need to be addressed.
And it sounds like Jack was starting to realize that. He describes having this moment of clarity where it finally hits him. Porn is negatively affecting his life, and he decides he needs to quit.
That recognition, that willingness to acknowledge the problem, is often the first step towards recovery.
But quitting wasn't easy. He talks about multiple attempts to stop, struggling with intense feelings of loneliness and what he believed were withdrawal symptoms. So even though he knew he needed to quit, his brain and body were fighting against him.
This is where understanding the brain's response to addiction is so important. Those neural pathways associated with the addictive behavior, they become really ingrained. And breaking free requires rewiring those pathways. It's not just about willpower. It's about retraining your brain to respond differently.
So physiological as much as psychological.
Exactly. And what's interesting here is that Jack describes feeling the most lonely during his attempts to quit, even though he should have been feeling proud of himself.
That's almost paradoxical.
Yeah.
He was craving the very connection that porn was supposedly providing, even though he knew it was artificial and harmful.
It speaks to the complexity of addiction. It's not simply about pleasure or gratification. It's often about fulfilling those deeper emotional needs that haven't been met in healthy ways.
So it sounds like Jack's journey is just beginning. We've seen his early exposure, the development of his addiction, and his first attempts to break free. But what happens next?
Well, that's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned as we delve into Jack's struggles and triumphs on his path toward recovery and self-discovery. So we left off with Jack, kind of at a crossroads, grappling with that loneliness, even as he's trying to break free. It's a reminder that recovery isn't linear, right? There are setbacks, emotional hurdles.
Yeah, and even though he was making a conscious effort to quit, Jack still faced some challenges. He started telling his friends about his decision, and one of them actually showed him some explicit content in class, almost like a test.
It's interesting, isn't it? Like a resistance to the change, maybe a desire to keep the status quo, or maybe a fear that his friend's journey will reflect on them.
Yeah, peer pressure can be a powerful thing, especially with something like this. But here's the interesting part. Jack says he looked at it and felt like a kid again. The desire wasn't there anymore.
Wow, that's a powerful shift. The rewiring was working, so to speak, those neural pathways weakening.
But even with that progress, Jack still had his struggles, especially with confidence around women.
It highlights that recovery isn't a linear process, right? Different aspects of our lives can heal at different paces.
He describes himself as very, very nervous around women because he hadn't really learned how to interact with them in a healthy way.
Absolutely. It's like the years spent immersed in pornography created this disconnect between virtual experiences and real human interaction.
So it's not just rewiring neural pathways, but also those social pathways.
Exactly, learning to connect authentically.
And that's where Jack's story takes a turn. He talks about building his confidence, but emphasizes that the most important part of recovery was finding a connection with something deeper than just physical attraction.
It's such a profound realization, isn't it? That true fulfillment doesn't come from chasing fleeting pleasures or seeking external validation.
He describes this moment sitting outside his grandparents' house, watching the sunset, feeling at peace, connected with nature.
The power of mindfulness, connecting with something larger than ourselves.
And he contrasts this with how he felt when consumed by pornography, saying he could never experience that kind of deep connection, always seeking that external gratification.
Trapped in a cycle, right? Seeking fulfillment in the wrong places.
And Jack addresses the listener directly, acknowledging that if they're struggling, it's hard, but worth it.
It's that message of hope. Not minimizing the difficulty, but emphasizing the reward.
He talks about those intense withdrawal symptoms, the loneliness,
The resilience of the human spirit, the power of facing our challenges.
He says every time you get an urge, remind yourself, giving in is not going to solve the issue, only delay it.
Recognizing those urges for what they are, temporary impulses that don't have to control us.
I believe in you, he says. Sometimes you just got to believe in yourself.
Self-compassion, encouragement, believing in our own ability to change.
Jack's journey is a deeply personal one, but offers valuable insights,
The honesty and vulnerability make his message all the more powerful.
underscoring the importance of healthy connections, finding things that nourish our souls.
Jack's story is a reminder. We have the power to choose how we live our lives.
As we conclude this part of our deep dive, what resonates most with you?
The power of personal transformation.
We are not defined by our past.
It all starts with a single step.
As we move into the final part, let's hold on to that sense of possibility. It's really something, right? How impactful these personal stories can be. Like reading about addiction in a textbook, it's one thing. But hearing someone describe it, their struggles, their triumphs, it just hits different.
See, it does. It makes it real. Reminds us there are real people behind the statistics. And recovery isn't just a concept, It's a lived reality.
For sure. And what's so compelling about Jack's story is he's not claiming to be an expert. He's just sharing what worked for him.
Exactly. And that opens up space for conversation.
Right. Just honest conversation. He's not preaching, not judging, just being vulnerable, being real.
And that creates connection, understanding, which can be so powerful for listeners who, might be going through something similar.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to remember there's no one-size-fits-all solution, right?
Right. What works for one might not work for another. But sharing these stories, sharing experiences, creates this sense of community and support, lets others know they're not alone.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Jack's story, what are some of the key takeaways?
Well, I think one of the biggest is that pornography addiction, it's a real issue. It can have serious consequences for relationships, mental health, physical well-being, even your sense of purpose.
Yeah, and Jack's story really underscores that, the addictive nature of it, how it can hijack our brains.
Absolutely, those ingrained patterns of behavior, so difficult to break.
But there's also this message of recovery, personal growth.
Yes, it is possible to break free, to create a more authentic life.
More fulfilling, more connected.
And it's not just about quitting porn. It's about addressing the underlying issues,
Right, the unmet needs, loneliness, low self-esteem, difficulty with relationships, lack of purpose.
It's about the whole person.
Not just the symptom.
Exactly. Recovery is holistic. Physical, emotional, social well-being.
Jack's story raises broader questions, too, about how we consume media in general, how it shapes our thoughts and feelings, even behaviors. What are your thoughts on that?
It's so important to consider, right? We're saturated with media. It's easy to get numb to its impact. We need to be more aware. What am I watching? What am I reading? How's it affecting me?
Yeah, what void am I trying to fill? What do I really need?
We have a choice. Passive consumers or active conscious consumers.
Jack's story reminds us we have that power to choose.
If you're struggling, you're not alone. There are resources, therapists, counselors, support groups, friends, family.
Recovery is possible. It's a journey, not always easy, but with courage, self-compassion, and support, you can break free.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep striving to become the best version of yourselves.